Ladies and gentlemen, damas y caballeros. See, if that were a literal translation from Spanish, I'd have to say dames and chevalier, which are both words that do exist, but doesn't exactly fit the context. Let's talk about another specific subject. And I'm betraying my translation friends here left and right, recording all these horrible interpreting clips, but no, they're not horrible, and I'll probably do a translation clip right after. Maybe wax poetic and romantic and talk about song or poetry, something of the sort. But right now let's talk about a very practical subject, interpreting in immigration, which lately, because of the political context or because of whatever, I've had a lot of. Over the course of my career, I've had a lot of immigration interpreting, but lately pretty much every week. And as any other context and as any other field, it has its specifics. It is, in a way, a legal setting. It is not an illegal setting, but it's not exactly a legal setting. Very often for interviews, I'm specifically going to talk about probably interviews. Maybe we'll detour into court cases, but immigration interviews. And what are the specifics of that? Well, first of all, the specific is that unlike courts, unlike depositions, it does not require, at this stage of the game in the United States, it does not require any sort of a certified interpreter. They can bring their brother, their sister, their dog, their cat, as long as the dog and cat is fluent in 2 languages and can sign, and so forth. So to some degree it's maybe harder to compete for that job, but I have found that the lawyers and the people are pretty smart about it, because maybe there are enough horror stories going around about bad interpreting, and I've actually seen cases where their interview was stopped and canceled because of incompetent interpreting. So people usually do seek out court or competent interpreters, which is good. And if they don't, that's a piece of advice that you can give them. Not even as a sales point. It is a sales point, but if they reach out to you, you can say something like, you're very smart to be reaching out to me, because some people just bring anybody and everybody, and it doesn't turn out well. So if for whatever reason we don't agree, please make sure that on something, just please make sure that it's going to be somebody competent. But I wouldn't usually say it like that, because you're sort of anti-selling. But let's talk about the job itself. Like in many interpreting cases, there is a preparation stage. So I always ask for their affidavits, which is the story, the sworn testimony that they have provided to USCIS, which is United States Citizenship and Immigration Service, I believe. So if you read their story in advance, it will logically make sense. On the day of, you don't have to be trying to follow the story if they're being a little incoherent, and they might be incoherent because either they are incoherent inherently, not many people are, but some are, or they're nervous or whatever. So if you have already read their story, it's going to be easier. And if you're also a translator, then you also you upsell and you offer to translate their affidavit, but many people will already have their affidavit translated because they will contact you several weeks before the interview. But at least read it, and at least you can be sort of nasty about it and say, the translation is good, but they have a hard time with articles and there are some mistakes, and that way you can establish yourself as an expert. I do that routinely. In fact, I did that on several recent cases, and you're actually adding value. It doesn't necessarily take a long time to fix a few meaning inaccuracies or style mistakes, but you're establishing yourself as an expert. Don't necessarily insult or invalidate your colleague, but you can establish yourself as a higher level expert if you are, by being nicely pedantic and didactic about it, right? Like, for example, in the last translation, affidavit translation, the translator used the word cult, whereas in Russian it's sect. And I understand, actually. At first I was like, why? Why would she even do that? Is it just a blunder? And if you haven't seen my chess video about blunders and mistakes, here or there or somewhere, it wasn't a blunder. Actually, she had a reason because later on the guy provides an insult that he used to be called, which exists in Russian but doesn't exist in English, sectant. And the word sectant doesn't exist in English. The word cultist does. So that was reasoning, and it was actually good reasoning. I think I don't know who the translator was, but by the style of translation and the actually high caliber of translation, I think her name is Galina. So if you ever see this clip, Galina, kudos to you, actually good job. But I suggested, no, let's actually use sect, and instead of sectant, we're gonna use sect fanatic. My other choice was sect goer, but sect goer just sounds weird, and it also sounds neutral. And because it was an insult, I didn't feel like fanatic would be an addition. Like the word fanatic wasn't in Russian, but it is the spirit of what he was called, because he was being insulted. So I got detoured, but it's a good detour. Yeah, ask for affidavits definitely beforehand, and it might establish you as a translator for them in any future cases. Okay, but also for your own preparation. I mean, obviously arrive early, obviously plan for traffic, because these jobs are always done in person. Grab your coffee if you need it. And here's a really important point. Bring your notepad. Yes, they can sometimes provide paper and a pen for you, but it provides an air of professionality when you bring your own. Here's a really important point. People will understandably be super nervous on that day. Some of them had waited for 8 years before they're called in, many years, and they're nervous. So you have to be on the opposite end of the spectrum. You have to portray this air of calm, serenity, and confidence and nonchalance, And very often, because it is not a court setting, and you're allowed to talk to the person, you can talk to them by phone, you can talk to them when you get there, and I'll just help them chill out, just by nice, pleasant communication, by conveying the fact that I'm a professional, not saying so, but just your demeanor. That's really important in this setting, in any setting, but especially in this setting. Very often in immigration interviews, especially in Minnesota, you will have to sign a form as an interpreter, and it has these different clauses, these different lines, that the person is supposed to read and understand and sign. And it's very good to interpret these 6 or 7 lines beforehand. It's basically like saying, I understand that, the interpreter will get access to my confidential information, blah, 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 blah. I have had a chance to speak to the interpreter, and he or she speaks my native language, and we can understand each other, blah, 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 blah. So why do I like to do that beforehand? Well, first of all, when the immigration officer asks you to interpret it, you can say, oh, I already have, and you don't waste time. And it's always good to interpret, because it's not a good practice for the person to sign something they don't understand. Some of them may choose to do so, but I think it's not ideal. Secondly, and more importantly, it already establishes you as an expert, because let's say they have a lawyer with them, or let's say they have somebody else who's fluent in Russian and English, which will very often happen, like their husband, their son, whatever, and by your fluency of sight translation, and you better have fluency of sight translation, and if you don't, then watch my video on sight translation, and here it is, and if we haven't done it, then Rick can shame me into doing it, but you establish yourself as an interpreter, plus you get a little warm-up. It only takes a minute, but voila, you've already interpreted, and you've shown them how competent you are, and that's even before going in. And once you're in, unfortunately, the setting, at least when I've interpreted, is usually not the best, because they place the non-English speaker tete-a-tete, face-to-face, with the officer, and they place you before a computer screen, so you can't quite see the officer, which I don't like, because I like seeing everybody's faces. And sometimes I've asked to sit next to the person, and sometimes the officer will allow it, and sometimes they won't, but I like to see everybody. Even if they are behind the computer screen, it's not a big deal, but if you can avoid it, right? Then they will place both of you under oath. Obviously, you under oath to interpret correctly. And by the way, here's a little trick. Here you see the evolution of Vladimir through the years. In one court case years ago, a judge said to me, do you swear to interpret literally? I said, no, Your Honor, because it's nonsense. And Your Honor said, but all your colleagues do it. And I said, they're wrong. And His Honor said, but I can hold you in contempt of court or kick you out. And I said, you can, but it's against my integrity. I'm still not gonna say it. And I won the argument. But later I developed a little stratagem or a trick. And when immigration officers tell me, do you swear to blah blah blah, interpret literally, which is a stupid phrasing that they have, and I've even written to USCIS and said please change your phrasing. But anyway, I don't want to violate my personal and professional integrity, but I don't want to create a situation either by saying no, because a lot of these officers are they're nice people, but they're bureaucrats, you know, not to be mean, but to some degree they are. They have to follow the rules to the T, and if you say no, I can't, then you're just creating an unnecessary situation, a hassle. And I basically say, yes, I swear to interpret faithfully and correctly, which I have sworn to what I have sworn to, but they think I said yes to their question. But in a few cases I just said yes, and I know that I'm just going to do whatever I'm going to do. I know that by literally they actually mean correctly, so to hell with it. A little aside. What else? We've talked about having your notepad, placing it somewhere. That's another reason I don't like to be in front of a computer, because there's little room to place the notepad, but place it comfortably so you can take notes, blah, 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 blah. And then obviously just go to town, do your normal interpretation job. In that context, it is usually good to keep the segment, sorry, I've been sitting for a while, relatively short, especially because the immigration officer has to type. And most of them are really good typists, but the last one I had, I went into my normal mode of long segments, and he just absolutely couldn't follow me. And he had to ask and ask and ask again, and then I was like, okay, fine. And I just went into shorter segments. But he was just honestly green and inexperienced. This was obvious. Also by the questions that he asked. And this is a very interesting point. But evaluation of importances is very often a green light or a rapid indicator to how clever a person is or how experienced they are in their profession. Like, I just like to give this example of a lady who wasn't an interpreter, and she taught a course on interpreting, and she spent like an hour talking about where to place your chair. And my retort is, who cares, darn it? I mean, you only care to the degree that it has to facilitate communication, but don't spend an hour talking about where to place your chair. Talk about the important things in life and in interpreting. So this guy just kept asking lots of non-consequential questions, like, I don't know, where did you get your passport and where did you get married? And he basically hardly asked about the grounds for political asylum. And the person was actually worried. The person was like, why didn't they ask me? Does it mean something? And I said, I'm not your lawyer, so don't ask me for legal advice, but I can obviously see that he's just not as experienced. He didn't know what the NETSC was. He didn't know any of these things, which immigration officers are usually very smart people. At least they're very educated in the topic that they're interviewing about, and they will normally know these things. Because they also have to study up beforehand, like you study up beforehand. So normally it is not necessary to explain to them what Ukraine is or what the NETSC is or who Putin is and so forth, You can see the types of cases that I do. But anyway, so yeah, just keep it calm. Very often these cases will go on for hours. Like in California, for some reason, they tend to go for longer. And voila. I mean, kind of an unpleasant point, but there are people who obviously make up stories and lie. It is not our job or role. Sorry, I think I need a run or a swim to stretch out my limbs, but it is not our role to be moralists in this case, and you obviously interpret whatever you interpret. But I've had a guy years ago in California when we went to the restroom during break, and he was bragging to me about like how it was obviously a made-up story, and I was like, I don't care to know this, I don't need to know this, I was disgusted with it. When people ask me for advice, I make very, very sure that I'm not their lawyer and they know this, but I just say these immigration officers are very trained to catch lies and inconsistencies, and I would just be honest and tell the truth and tell things as they are, and if you don't know, say I don't know, and immigration officers will instruct them always to do the same thing. But be careful that you don't cross the being their lawyer line, because it's okay to, be personable and answer a question, but it's not okay to be their lawyer. In many cases, you will have what's called a monitor, which is alternatively called a Czech interpreter on the phone. Not always, but sometimes. Honestly, I used to hate not these guys, but the situation, because my mental attitude was like, who are they to monitor the great Vladimir? No. It's not about being narcissistic and egoistic, but it is to some degree. It can to some degree be unpleasant, especially when it's not your colleague and when you don't see them in person. When it's somebody over the phone out there in Timbuktu or in Australia. They're not going to be in Australia. But you can also understand the viewpoint that it is not always a professional like you or like me who is going to an immigration interview. It can be amateurs, to put it mildly, and so a Czech interpreter is needed. It's not a bad idea. So you have to, at the same time, be confident and be courteous, So what I like to do is establish myself as a pro, and these Czech interpreters will often introduce themselves and they will say, I'm here to monitor the interpretation to make sure nothing gets omitted or added, and you can ask me for advice on anything. And I usually say, at least in my last interviews, I've sort of worked this out for myself and say, well, thank you. I don't think it will be necessary. I am a veteran court interpreter, but thank you. And they already know you're a court interpreter, and that probably means you're already a better interpreter than they are, not necessarily. And then what do you do if they actually do interfere? Well, you do what you would normally do. You don't let your ego blow up, but at the same time, you don't let it deflate, right? You evaluate the mistake or the alleged mistake on its own merits. If they say, I don't know, okay, if you interpret something as asylee and they say, well, it should be refugee, and if they're correct, you say, they're correct, and you fix your interpretation. I did that once recently when the guy said something like, I opened up my business and I think I misheard or I misinterpreted, and I said we opened up because it was a family business, and the monitor was on the ball, and he said, actually, the non-English speaker said, I verified. I said, excuse me, the interpreter needs to clarify, or maybe I didn't say that, but I don't remember. So I clarified, and he did say that he said so I fixed my interpretation. But if I didn't make a mistake, I would say, actually, the interpreter stands by his interpretation. And I've also sometimes sort of politely put them in their place by saying this word means blah, blah, blah. Therefore, the interpretation is correct. I stand by it. But don't get into a quibble or a fight or a skirmish with a monitor, because, at the end of the day, you're on the same side, your colleagues. So just kind of an interesting, slightly touchy, delicate situation, but it's okay. Like in my last interview, over 4 hours, they didn't say a single thing. In the interview prior to that, they said 2 comments, one of which was wrong, one of which was right. So it's no big deal. Just basically know your worth, be good, be competent, and then you don't have to worry about the monitor interpreter. I always get prepayment, or actually full prepayment, normally always, for these interviews, because it does several things. 1, it gives you some extra cash in advance. 2, it puts it on your schedule, because now you have a commitment, and it gets these people to commit as well, because now they're committed. They're not going to look for like cheaper options, other options, so it's good. And don't be afraid. That's more of a sales tip, but they say, oh, you want me to pay you now? You say, yeah, because I'm a very busy person, and just to make sure that we fully book this and that I'm yours for these 3-4 hours or whatever, yes. I just personally don't like half payments or 50% payments, and it's usually no problem. If you have established yourself as a trustworthy professional in your conversation, it's usually no problem. That's about probably all I had to say today about immigration interpreting. Now I need some more coffee, and you guys need to take a break from my superb channel. No, you don't have to take a break. If you haven't seen my video on depositions, we'll put that in the clip right now, and go ahead and watch it.